This flight is not going to land. You need to sit down.
We're experiencing a systems anomaly. Requesting immediate vectors for diversion.
Miss, you'd better read that. 05 forged ahead. It became a mythology. Books were written, films were made, television documentaries dissected every theory. The name D.B. Cooper became a cultural shorthand for the...
November 24th, 1971, 2:47 p.m. Portland International Airport, Oregon, United States of America. The sky above Portland was the color of a bruise, deep gray, swollen with cold November clouds that pressed low against the earth as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The temperature had dropped to near freezing. A thin, biting wind moved across the tarmac, rattling the ground equipment and pulling at the coats of the ground crew who moved mechanically between aircraft, their breath rising in pale clouds before being swallowed by the gray afternoon. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Every terminal in America was crowded that day. Families, soldiers returning home, businessmen racing to close deals before the holiday. Nobody was paying attention to anyone in particular. That is exactly the kind of day.
At Gate 52 of Portland International Airport, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 sat on the tarmac, a Boeing 727 aircraft, its engines cold, its cabin being prepared for a routine 30-minute flight to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. It was one of the most unremarkable flights in America that day. Short, domestic, largely empty. Only 36 passengers had booked seats on a plane that could carry more than 100. The crew was small and experienced. Captain William Scott at the controls, co-pilot William Ratachik beside him. Flight attendants Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow moving through the cabin, checking overhead compartments, straightening headrests, performing the quiet, invisible choreography of pre-flight routine that passengers never notice and never think about. One passenger was already seated. He had arrived early. He had chosen seat 18C, an aisle seat in the rear section of the aircraft, deliberately positioned away from families, away from clusters of conversation, away from anyone who might remember a face too clearly. He wore a dark business suit, a black tie over a white shirt. He carried a single black briefcase. He had purchased his ticket that same day at the airport counter in cash. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked twice. He ordered a bourbon and soda when Florence Schaffner came through the cabin, paid for it politely, tipped generously, and sat with the calm, unhurried stillness of a man who had absolutely nothing to worry about. But Dan Cooper had everything planned. Every second of what was about to happen had already been constructed inside his mind with the cold precision of an architect. He was not nervous, he was not excited, he was not afraid. He simply waited. And at exactly 2:58 p.m., Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway. 36 passengers settled into their seats. The engines rose to a low, steady roar, and the Boeing 727 lifted off the ground, climbing into the bruised Oregon sky, carrying with it one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of the United States of America. The aircraft had barely reached cruising altitude when Dan Cooper made his move. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He did not produce a weapon in the open air of the cabin. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew a small folded note, and held it out calmly toward Florence Schaffner as she passed his row. Florence, trained by years of managing demanding passengers, initially assumed it was a phone number. A lonely businessman on a short flight. She had seen it 1,000 times. She slipped the note into her pocket without reading it and continued down the aisle. Dan Cooper watched her walk away. Then, quietly, without moving from his seat, he leaned slightly toward her as she returned and said only 4 words.
Miss, you'd better read that.
Florence Schaffner reached into her pocket. She unfolded the note, and the world she had known 30 seconds ago ceased to exist. The note said that he had a bomb, that it was inside his briefcase, that this was a hijacking. Florence Schaffner was 23 years old. She had been a flight attendant for less than 2 years. In that moment, in the narrow aisle of a Boeing 727, flying at 24,000 feet above the state of Oregon, she had to make a decision that would determine whether 36 people lived or died. She did not panic. She did not scream. She walked calmly to the seat beside Dan Cooper and sat down. She asked, in a voice she forced to remain steady, if she could see the bomb. Cooper opened his briefcase slightly, just enough. Inside, she saw a mass of red cylinders, wiring, and what appeared to be a battery. Whether it was real or not, Florence Schaffner could not know. And that uncertainty was the most powerful weapon Dan Cooper carried. She walked to the cockpit. She told Captain Scott, and within minutes, Northwest
Orient Airlines Flight 305, a routine 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle, became the most dangerous aircraft in American skies. Captain William Scott immediately contacted Northwest Orient's Seattle Operations Center via radio. The airline in turn contacted the FBI and local law enforcement. Within minutes, the full machinery of the United States federal government began to move. But moving fast means nothing when your enemy is already inside the plane, already in control, already 10 steps ahead of every decision you are about to make. The FBI scrambled agents to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Police units were positioned, negotiators were briefed, and all of it, every phone call, every order, every carefully laid plan, had to happen quietly, invisibly, without triggering the man sitting in seat 18C with his briefcase and his bourbon and his terrifying stillness. Dan Cooper had communicated his demands through Tina Mucklow, the senior flight attendant, whom he had asked to sit with him for the remainder of the flight. His demands were extraordinary in their specificity. $200,000 in cash, negotiable, unmarked $20 bills. 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. A fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft upon landing. And the assurance that no law enforcement personnel would approach the plane on the ground. He wanted the money and the parachutes delivered to the aircraft. He wanted the passengers released. And this was the part that made every FBI agent in Seattle go cold, he wanted the plane to take off again. He was not trying to escape on the ground. He was planning to escape from the sky. The FBI and Northwest Orient Airlines had very little choice. Refusing the demands of a man on a plane at 24,000 feet with a reported bomb and 36 civilian lives was not an option any commander was willing to authorize. The decision was made to comply. Agents scrambled to assemble $200,000 in $20 bills. The serial numbers of every single bill were photographed before the money was packed. 4 parachutes were located and rushed to the airport. Everything was prepared with meticulous, desperate speed. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. It taxied to a remote area of the tarmac, away from terminals, away from cameras, away from the eyes of the public. The engines were kept running. Outside, in the gray November evening, FBI agents watched from a distance, their hands steady, their minds calculating every possible intervention point, and finding none that did not risk the lives inside that cabin. A single airline representative approached the plane and delivered the package, $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes through the forward air stair door. Cooper examined everything carefully. He checked the money. He checked the parachutes. He was satisfied. He then allowed all 36 passengers to leave the aircraft. One by one, they walked down the stairs and across the tarmac into the waiting arms of law enforcement, who were under strict orders not to react, not to alert, not to give a single signal that anything other than a routine deplaning was occurring. The passengers were pale, shaking, some weeping quietly. Most had not known the full extent of what was happening until that moment. They had been told only that there was a minor mechanical issue. The truth hit them on the tarmac like the cold November air, sudden, brutal, impossible to prepare for. Inside the plane, Dan Cooper sat alone with Tina Mucklow, Captain Scott, co-pilot Radachak, and flight engineer Harold Anderson. He had kept the crew. He needed them. The plane refueled in silence. Cooper communicated his next demand. The aircraft was to fly to Mexico City. The route would take them south. The altitude was to be kept below 10,000 feet. The landing gear was to remain deployed. The cabin was to remain unpressurized. The flaps were to be set at 15 degrees. These were not the demands of a desperate man making things up as he went. These were the demands of someone who understood aircraft, who understood aerodynamics, altitude, parachute deployment windows, and radar coverage with the fluency of a professional. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off from Seattle for the second time that evening. Somewhere behind it, unseen by Cooper, two United States Air Force F-106 fighter jets scrambled into the sky and took up position, one ahead, one behind, tracking the Boeing 727 through the dark November night. A Lockheed T-33 train jet also joined the pursuit. The most sophisticated military tracking operation in Northwest American history had been launched to follow one man in a business suit with a briefcase and $200,000 in cash. And not a single one of those aircraft could do anything, because the moment they moved on that plane, 37 lives ended. At approximately 8:13 p.m., somewhere over the dark wilderness of southwestern Washington state, a region of dense forest, deep river canyons, and near total darkness, Tina Mucklow noticed something. She was seated in the forward section of the cabin. She felt a change in air pressure, a shift in the atmosphere of the plane that she could not immediately explain. She walked toward the rear of the aircraft and discovered that the aft air stair,
Rear boarding ramp built into the tail section of the Boeing 727, a feature found on very few commercial aircraft in the world, had been lowered. It was open. The cold night air was rushing into the cabin at over 150 miles per hour. The roar was immense. And Dan Cooper, the man in the dark suit, the black tie, the white shirt, with his briefcase and his parachute and his $200,000, was gone. He had jumped. Into the dark, into the rain, into the freezing night sky above the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, at an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet, in near zero visibility, in a driving rainstorm, wearing a business suit and loafers, with no helmet, no altimeter, no GPS, no survival gear, no plan that any rational person could call survivable. And yet, he was never found. Captain Scott immediately radioed air traffic control. The fighter jets attempted to pinpoint the location of the jump. Ground teams were assembled. Within hours, one of the largest manhunts in FBI history had been launched across the mountains and forests of southwestern Washington. Hundreds of agents, state troopers, and military personnel fanned out across the wilderness. Helicopters swept the tree line. Dogs were brought in. The Columbia River, which runs through the probable jump zone, was searched. For days, for weeks, for months. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a trace of the parachute. Not a single fragment of the $200,000. Not a body. Dan Cooper had walked into a Boeing 727 as an ordinary man and had walked out of history as a legend. The FBI investigation that followed was the longest active case in Bureau history. It was given a code name, Norjack, short for Northwest Hijacking. Over the following decades, more than 1,000 suspects were investigated. Every man who had ever served in the military with parachute training. Every man with a criminal record connected to air travel. Every man who had disappeared from public life around November 1971. All of them were pulled into the orbit of the investigation and examined.
Lead agent Ralph Himmelsbach dedicated years of his life to the case, becoming so consumed by it that colleagues described it as a second identity. He believed, with absolute conviction, that Cooper had died in the jump, that the wilderness had swallowed him, and that his bones lay somewhere in the forest of Washington state, undiscovered, unmarked, unidentifiable. But belief is not evidence, and evidence was precisely what the FBI could not find. In 1980, 9 years after the hijacking, a young boy named Brian Ingram was picnicking with his family along the north bank of the Columbia River, near the town of Tina Bar, Washington. While digging in the sand at the river's edge, he unearthed 3 small packets of decayed, disintegrating $20 bills. The serial numbers matched. They were part of D.B. Cooper's ransom money. It was the first and only Physical evidence ever recovered from the case. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered.
The bills had clearly been in the water for years, but the manner in which they had degraded and the location where they were found did not align with any of the FBI's projected jump zones or river current models. They should not have been there, and yet they were. The FBI ran the serial numbers against every bank in the country. Not a single other bill from the ransom had ever appeared in circulation. Not one. In the years since 1971, if Cooper had survived and spent even a fraction of that money, one bill, just one, would have surfaced somewhere. In a shop, in a bank deposit, in a cash transaction. The fact that none ever did told investigators one of only two things. Either Cooper was dead and the money was rotting somewhere in the wilderness alongside him, or he was alive and had hidden the money so perfectly in a life so thoroughly constructed that not a single thread connected him to it. Neither answer was satisfying. Both were terrifying in their own way. Over the decades, the case of D.B. Cooper became something far larger than a federal investigation. It became a mythology. Books were written, films were made. Television documentaries dissected every theory, every suspect, every fragment of evidence. The name D.B. Cooper, itself a mistake, a misidentification by an early press report that confused Dan Cooper with a completely unrelated man named D.B. Cooper in the Pacific Northwest, became a cultural shorthand for the perfect crime, the impossible escape, the ghost who beat the system. He was romanticized in ways that made Ralph Himmelsbach furious. The FBI agent who had spent his career hunting Cooper had no patience for the folklore. To him, Cooper was not a folk hero. He was a criminal who had terrorized a crew and passengers and had endangered lives for personal gain. But America, as it so often does, had made up its mind about the story it wanted to tell. Suspects emerged and vanished like smoke. A man named Richard Floyd McCoy hijacked another aircraft just months after Cooper's jump, using a nearly identical method, and was caught. But investigators could not definitively connect him to the original crime. A man named Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Airlines employee, was named by his own brother as a possible candidate years after his death. The brother claiming that Kenneth had once said he had done something that would shock everyone he knew. But Kenneth Christensen was dead, and the dead cannot be charged. A man named L.D. Cooper was named by a niece who claimed he had confessed the hijacking to her on his deathbed. But the FBI examined the evidence and found it inconclusive. Dozens more names surfaced over 5 decades. None survived the full scrutiny of the investigation. In July 2016, the FBI announced that it was suspending active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case, redirecting resources toward what it described as more pressing priorities. After 45 years, after more than 1,000 suspects, after millions of dollars spent and countless man-hours consumed, the Bureau was stepping back. The case was not closed. It was never officially closed, but active pursuit had ended. D.B. Cooper remained, officially and permanently, unidentified. November 24, 2024 marked the 53rd anniversary of the hijacking. Somewhere in the forests of Washington state, or perhaps in a quiet house in an ordinary American town, behind an ordinary face that had lived an ordinary life for half a century, the answer exists. It has always existed. Every mystery has a solution buried inside it, waiting with infinite patience for the moment a human mind is finally sharp enough, or lucky enough, to find it. The money, or what remains of it, is somewhere. The parachutes are somewhere. The truth of who Dan Cooper was, what he had done before that Wednesday afternoon in Portland, what he did in the minutes after he stepped off that rear air stair into the black and screaming sky, that truth is somewhere too. But the sky above the Pacific Northwest is enormous. The forests are deep and dark and indifferent. And a man who wanted to disappear, who planned every detail with such extraordinary precision, who moved through an airport and a hijacking and a midnight parachute jump with the calm of a man who had rehearsed it all 1,000 times. That kind of man does not leave traces by accident. Dan Cooper looked at the world below him from 10,000 feet in the air, in the rain, in the dark, and the cold. And he stepped off the edge, and the sky took him, and the earth gave nothing back. The case remains open. The man remains unknown. And somewhere, in the silence between what we know and what we will never prove, D.B. Cooper is still falling.